To appreciate Gadamer's place in this conversation, we should turn back to look at the tradition of philosophy called phenomenology, because Gadamer's hermeneutics is best understood as belonging to the tradition of phenomenology, specifically as a version of hermeneutic phenomenology. So phenomenology has its roots. There are rare philosophical traditions where you can point to an origin figure, but in this case we can. It's an Edmund Husserl, who was active in the late 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century. He was Martin Heidegger's teacher. And Husserl developed this idea of phenomenology as a kind of way, making philosophy a rigorous science, as a way of dealing with the ambiguities and divergences that had arisen in philosophy in the 19th century. He thought there was a way of clarifying the essential role of philosophy so that it could finally be rigorous and come up with rigorous, almost scientific results. First, I should make clear that what he means by phenomenology is not internal subjective experiences. Sometimes that is the way it's used in philosophy. People will talk about the phenomenology of playing basketball. And what they mean is like the internal experience, what its likeness, the personal experience of playing basketball. This is not what Husserl means by phenomenology. The central motto of phenomenology, and again, it's rare that philosophical movements have mottos, but I think they all should have some sort of motto or slogan, is to the things themselves. That is the motto of phenomenology. I like to imagine that these are all young people on a phenomenological march chanting to the things themselves. The idea of phenomenology is not that we turn inward into our minds in order to access our subject experiences, but that we turn outward to the world and to the things in the world and try to access those things as carefully as possible through accessing the way they are disclosed to us, to our minds. At the heart of phenomenology is this idea called intentionality. And again, that can be confusing. It's not intentional in the sense of intentionally trying to do something, or intentionality, doing something with intentionality means knowing what you are trying to do. That is not it. Intentionality is the idea that mental states, beliefs, desires, wants are all about something. So to believe something is to believe that something. To have a desire is to desire that something. They already have what we call an intentional content. Because of that, because of intentionality, because of the aboutness of our mental states, we can understand the world by describing as carefully as possible what our mental states tell us about it. So Husserl's goal was to arrive at kind of a pure description of philosophical topics. For example, say we're going to talk about the topic of freedom, a classic issue in the history of philosophy. Let's describe as accurately, carefully, in Husserl's words, as presuppositionlessly as possible what freedom is like, right? Capture the essence of freedom through a pure description of it. This is actually a sample of Husserl's own writing. He left us 40,000 pages of phenomenological note-taking, of descriptions of things of philosophical relevance, and they're done in his own sort of idiosyncratic shorthand, so they only can be read by very few people, but most of them have been transcribed at this point. At the heart of phenomenology, and what we really want to focus on, is the idea that when you experience something, what you are given is not just what is presented to you. So in this case here we have an example of a candle. And when you see a candle, Husserl argues, what you are also aware of is you're aware of it as, for example, a three-dimensional object. That's why when you move around the candle, you're not surprised to see it has a backside. Right? You're not surprised to find that the candle persists in space and time because you are perceptually aware of it as a three-dimensional object. That belongs, Husserl says, to the perceptual givenness of the object. That's not something our mind is just inferring from what's given to us. That belongs to the experience of the candle. Right? And these are the things, this richness of experience is what allows the philosophical, phenomenological descriptions of experiences to access the nature of things, Husserl thinks. In fact, Husserl will say it doesn't even matter whether you're looking at a real candle or not, because you still can describe it. In this case, this isn't a real candle. This is a painting of a candle. So when we experience things, we experience them as something. We experience candles as three-dimensional objects, as persisting over time, as having certain sort of causal relations, as being hot, as being maybe a fire hazard. Right? That is not something that we infer from this experience. That is something you look at and you see immediately. Candle, curtain, fire hazard. So Husserl wants to talk about that we are perceptually aware of more than just what is immediately given to us. All these extra aspects that belong to our perception, he calls the horizon of the experience. And we've seen that word be used by Gadamer in a very similar way, as the context which makes something intelligible as what it is. So we experience things as something. This interpretive structure belongs to the very structure of experience. In addition, there are what are called perceptual norms built into experience. When we experience something, we recognize the ways in which how we're experiencing it at that moment may be ideal or less than ideal. So we may look at the candle and it's dark and we're not quite sure of the color of the candle, and so we move it to the light, or we turn the lights on, or we adjust the way we move, we turn around to the other side, right? There are perceptual norms built into the very experience of something. So experiencing something isn't neutral. Belonging to the experience, the perceptual experience of something, are norms which orient us with respect to it, that allow us to experience it more or less accurately. So the accuracy of an experience is built into the very structure of an experience. Now, I didn't pick a candle just sort of randomly as an example. I picked it because it has a history in another philosophical tradition, but one that's relevant here, the tradition of American pragmatism. There was an important article by John Dewey in the 1890s where he took on what is called the reflex arc theory. Dewey was criticizing behaviorism and the way behaviorism explains behavior purely in terms of stimulus and response. As if all that's going on when a child touches a candle is the child reaches out, the stimulus is the candle, the response is the hand drawing back. Dewey says this is a much more complicated process. The process begins when the child enters the room and is perceptually drawn to the candle. So there already is in place a whole systems of norms, a whole systems of expectations that suggest that certain sorts of things in our environment should draw our attention and other things less so. The child didn't look and focus 1 foot to the right of the candle, for example. The child focused on the candle. And it is something about the way the candle was functioning in the environment, the way the light was dancing, that drew the child forward to putting her finger out to begin with. So Dewey says to properly understand what's going on in these situations, we need to understand that the experience is much richer than just simply a stimulus and response. That is, prior to have the perceptual, that sort of stimulus response, perception, input, response, there's a whole world of meanings that have taken place that even allow that to arise in the first place. At this point, you should recognize that what I'm talking about here in phenomenology and the phenomenological kind of perception is converging with what we talked about on the first day with the nature of understanding. Notice that in all these examples, whether going back to Husserl and moving around the candle and seeing it from the other side, right, recognizing it, or Dewey having things in an environment that call us to move and to point, we are recognizing that our perceptual awareness of a candle is an essentially embodied awareness, an embodied understanding of the candle in our environment, where our even imagined interactions with it would lead to certain sorts of perceptual consequences. So built into the structure of our perception of an object is a kind of perceptual know-how, a recognition that our bodily engagement with the object reveals certain things about it built into the structure of perception. And this is what we were emphasizing on the first day when we talked about understanding as a kind of grasping, a practical grasping of our environment. But at this point, in order to go further, we are going to need to move beyond phenomenology and its Husserlian roots and talk about the way that hermeneutic phenomenology, as taken up by Gadamer and Heidegger, and even someone named Scheler, moves us away from Husserl's starting point to better fit what we were talking about earlier today. So let's consider Gadamer's hermeneutic critique of Husserlian phenomenology. Let's consider Gadamer's move to hermeneutic phenomenology. The first criticism is a criticism of the idea of achieving a kind of pure perceptual standpoint. The idea that the goal of phenomenology is to purify our awareness such that we are able to describe it presuppositionlessly and arrive at a kind of description that then can be universally verified by others who have gone through the same rigorous clarifying of one's mental states in order to provide also a pure phenomenological description. Gadamer thinks that such purity of perception is, he calls it a fiction. Maybe it's an idealization. But it's not just an idealization. He thinks it's something that distorts it doesn't take seriously the ways in which we are constantly shaped by our past experiences, by what he calls our prejudgments, by our relationship to tradition, to culture, to language, in a way that those things make possible any understanding at all. So these background conditions for understanding, belonging to having a certain past, our brain relying on our past in order to predict what is happening in our future and our present, is not a problem for understanding. It could be a problem for understanding, depending on what has been passed on to us. But the very fact of there being background conditions that make possible things to be intelligible in the present is not itself a problem. It's a condition for making sense of anything at all. Right? So these prejudgments, as Gadamer calls them, are what enable us to become clear about things. Now, we always become clear about things in the way they show themselves to ourselves, and at the same time then, we are trying to make our prejudgments clear to ourselves to understand the ways in which they provide an accurate understanding of things or a distorted understanding of things. But this is the ongoing project of phenomenology, not the goal of trying to arrive at a pure description. So the ongoing project of phenomenology, understood properly, understood hermeneutically, is a project of interpretation and reinterpretation that clarifies our experiences and brings to consciousness our own prejudgments in ways that allows them to be a subject of conversation with others. The second point along the same lines that Gadamer will make about the limitations of pure perception is he will say, and he credits Shaler for this, and Shaler's debt to the American pragmatists, he will say we are fundamentally engaged practically in the world before we take it up theoretically and reflectively. This is what we talked about in the first day when we talked about the primacy of practice, what he inherits from Heidegger with the idea that we are practically engaged in the world and then come to articulate that understanding in language, though that very understanding is already shaped by language and interpretation. So it is a dialectical back and forth project where we draw the meanings out of our concrete engagement with the world, which is already meaning rich, try to bring those meanings into words, and in doing so clarify, revise, and become transformed. And you should recognize this too as the exact thing that Charles Taylor is talking about happens with respect to ourselves and our emotions. It is a process by which language is constitutive of emotions, and then we draw on language to help clarify the emotions, make them explicit to us, transform the emotions and ourselves in the process through the use of language. So that is the second thing that Gadamer is going to argue against this idea of pure perception. The first is that we're always shaped by background conditions, and the idea of trying to purge those for the sake of clarity doesn't make sense, although we should try to make those articulate and clear to ourselves. But second, our fundamental interactions with the world are not theoretical and reflective, but practical and interactive, as we've seen with the account of understanding on day one. Gadamer's second criticism of Husserl is going to be against the idea of the self that Husserl comes up with in his account of phenomenology. This idea that we should return to some sort of subject and provide the first-person phenomenological descriptions of the world, Gadamer thinks misses the ways in which we are fundamentally and essentially connected to other people. Our connections and relations to other people become a secondary feature of the way we function in the world, and in fact becomes problematic for Husserl to explain how it is we are aware of other subjects as subjects. Gadamer instead focuses on the idea of a person. And the person has a long history in Western intellectual thought. It goes back to the Romans with the idea of persona, and it's specified a kind of role, but it's a kind of role in a connection, in a collection of people, in a community. And Gadamer says this really is how we need to understand ourselves as hermeneutic selves, as people who are located in a community of interpreters, working together collectively through dialogue and through being shaped collectively by our past to collectively make clear our experiences, to bring things to understanding collectively in this shared social world that we inhabit. This is why Gadamer says in Truth and Method that we actually understand ourselves better through our institutions and through our histories and through our social practices than we do through processes of things like introspection. So the second criticism Gadamer wants to make about Husserlian phenomenology, and the second direction that hermeneutic phenomenology is going to take phenomenology, is towards the focus on community, towards the focus on persons as relational beings, and what Gadamer will later emphasize toward a kind of ethics based on friendship as a model of an ideal interaction with others, whether they are friends or strangers. But importantly, a core criticism of Husserl, and we've seen this sort of waiting in the background this whole time, is on Husserl's account of language. Husserl thinks that we sort of achieve an eidetic, an essential scene of the world, and then we find the words to describe that. So you see in this model what Taylor contrasted his expressive account of language with. The alternative Taylor presented was where things are given to us already fully made, and we're just trying to find the words to pick them out. The expressive account of language is that things come to their intelligibility and essentially formed through language. And that is Gadamer's view of language. That is the idea that Gadamer wants to stress, is that we don't first become clear about something and then we make that clarity linguistic. Rather, language turns out to be the medium through which all this takes place. Here is Gadamer himself talking about the relation between hermeneutic phenomenology to phenomenology, and in this case with special reference to the philosopher Wittgenstein.
Mehr. Der Name Wittgenstein ist heute einer der ganz großen Namen der Philosophie unseres Jahrhunderts. Und der zweite entsprechende Vorgang ist in unserer deutschen Tradition erfolgt. Ich meine den Übergang von der Phänomenologie im Stile und ihrer Vorgänger des Neukantianismus, aber insbesondere der Phänomenologie von Husserl, zu der hermeneutischen Wende, die Heidegger der Phänomenologie hinzugefügt hat. Da ist auch auf einmal das Sprachliche, die Grundverfassung des menschlichen Daseins, sprachlich zu sein, so beherrschend, dass sogar die Metaphysik, die Lehre von dem, was Sein heißt, offenbar in einen neuen Zusammenhang gerückt wird. Das Sprachgeschehen ist mehr ein Ereignis. Das Wort, das einer sagt, ist nicht einfach ein begriffliches Symbol, das man dann in formalisierter Form wiederum mathematisiert in Gleichungen darstellen kann. Das Wort ist auch da wieder eines, das einen trifft. Die Ausdrücke bei Wittgenstein sind ganz ähnlich. Er spricht von Sprachpragmatik. Das heißt, Sprache gehört in die Praxis, in das menschliche Miteinander und Zueinander. Und die Hermeneutik sagt, die Sprache gehört in das Gespräch. Das heißt, die Sprache ist überhaupt nur, was sie ist, wenn sie Verständigungsversuche, wenn sie Austausch und Rede und Gegenrede erfährt, wenn sie Antwort und Frage ist.
There you have Gadamer emphasizing the final piece of his response to phenomenology, and the final piece that moves us to hermeneutic phenomenology. That is, the focus on language and the understanding of ourselves as fundamentally linguistic. That is, the hermeneutic self is fundamentally not just self-interpreting, but linguistically self-interpreting, and self-interpreting because we are linguistic. Tomorrow, we're going to talk in greater detail about Gadamer's theory of language. Here I want to make a key point. So far, I've stressed the ways in which Gadamer's hermeneutic phenomenology criticizes Husserlian classical phenomenology. I want to emphasize now what it retains from Husserl's phenomenology, and that is the idea that our perceptual awareness of the world is rich with meanings in its givenness. That is, the richness of experience is not something we infer to, it is the fundamental way in which we are perceptually aware of the world. Now, Husserl's examples that I gave were about the candle, recognizing in the perception of the candle that it has a backside, that is three-dimensional, that exists through time. These are the various horizons that Husserl talks about that are active in our perceptual awareness of the world. Gadamer's focus on language is going to add to this story. So when we perceive things as calling forth language, as calling forth meanings, as something about which we could speak, about which we could describe. So the awareness of something as conceptualizable belongs to the experience of something, belongs to our perception of something. As some philosophers have put it, perception is conceptual. It's because we can see because we see things with our conceptual facilities active in the process of perception, that we can articulate them and make sense of them and recognize the ways that they're connected to other things. So language is fundamental for how we experience the world, how we perceive the world. And one of the main themes of this second day of my talks has been how fundamental language and interpretation is for our awareness of ourselves and our awareness of the world and for the construction of ourselves. And we started with Charles Taylor, and we talked about emotions and our emotions as a kind of affectual interpretation of the world, emotions as interpretive and shaped by language. And here with Husserl, with phenomenology, we add to that perceptions themselves are shaped by language. Perceptions themselves are shaped by concepts. So to have the concept of, to go back to our classic example of hermeneutical injustice, to have the concept of sexual harassment, right, allows us to be perceptually aware of sexual harassment when it happens. Right? That concept is active in our perception so that we literally see the harassment. Right? We see the ways in which this is happening. We see the meanings. We are perceptually aware of meanings. This is an important part of Husserl's phenomenology, and it's a part that Gadamer accepts and embraces and extends through his focus on language. But again, one of the main themes of the second day is wherever there is interpretation, there is a potential for hermeneutic injustice. So even in perception, perception itself is a kind of interpretation of the world in which meanings are revealed to us perceptually, and so too in the very way we perceptually disclose, the world is perceptually disclosed to us, so too are there possibilities for a kind of hermeneutic injustice to play itself out. Also then, As our language changes, as our concepts are transformed, so too is our perception transformed. And it's because of the richness of perception that this can happen. So tomorrow we're going to look more closely at Gadamer's theory of language, but I want to make clear that one thing he inherits from Husserl is this account of the richness of perception, and for Gadamer, a conceptual richness of perception that is a result of us being creatures with language, and that connects directly to the issues of hermeneutical injustice.